And we're live. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to those tuning in from the Southern Hemisphere. Welcome to the Whip Around Compliance Series, our first webinar on the vehicle maintenance basic. Sean insisted we go camera on today for a better engagement, so hopefully you can see us all, and both of our hairs looking all right. Quick introduction of who you're going to be listening to today. You've got myself, Tim, co-founder of Whip Around. We are a fleet inspection and maintenance compliance software based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm very fortunate to have Sean Garney with me, Vice President of Scopelitis Transportation Consulting. Sean, do you want to give us a little insight on you and Scopelitis?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. My name's Sean Garney, Vice President of Scopelitis Transportation Consulting. Been in the trucking industry for, about 20 years. Got my start delivering things like ice and landscape supplies, and spent some time as a broker, 10 years at the American Trucking Association advocating on behalf of the industry, a little time as a contractor to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and now I'm here at Scopelitis Transportation Consulting. It's me and Dave Osheki, which I know is a name familiar to many people, and we provide compliance services and consulting services to motor carriers and industry suppliers, do mock audits and all kinds of things. So it's been a fun run so far, and looking forward to diving into the webinar. I hope my hair's all right.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks, Sean, and thanks for the overview. Obviously, extremely qualified to help us through this webinar and give us an overview of something very dear to our hearts at Whip Around, but to a lot of people in the transport industry, and certainly to a lot of our customers. So thanks very much for being here. What we will cover today, we will spend the first part of this webinar, not a huge amount of time, because to many of you listening, we've got a very broad audience here today. It's going to be very familiar to a lot of you, who's who in motor carrier compliance in the US, who is bound by the FMCSA regulations, the systems and measures that are used to regulate and police the industry, a spotlight on the vehicle maintenance basic, obviously sort of the crux of why we're here today. Some tips to stay safe and compliant, which really boils down to avoiding fines and interventions. Sean will touch on what's next for compliance and some interesting things coming out of that space. And then a quick touch on the end, how Whip Around can simplify your maintenance and compliance processes. So a pretty solid agenda today, and hopefully some really insightful information that we can provide that you may not be across. So who's who in the US transport industry and how is it regulated? So at the very top of the tree is the Department of Transportation. Now, this is a huge organization most of you will be familiar with, and that really governs all things transport, from airlines to motor carriers and everything in between. And underneath that, one of their core agencies is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Association, and their key responsibility is to enforce safety and compliance, predominantly in the trucking industry, but their regulations do cross over into many other different carriers and operators, depending on the qualifications of their vehicle sizes and interstate versus intrastate commerce. We have state-level departments of transportation, and I've used some examples here just to show that there is a slight diversity in how they are structured. North Carolina, for example, has the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and under them sit the North Carolina Highway Patrol. They are tasked with enforcing the FMCSA regulations on behalf of the FMCSA and the DOT. In California, you have a slightly more layered cake there with the Californian State Transport Authority and the Caltrans above the California Highway Patrol. So depending state by state, you have different agencies tasked with policing and enforcing the regulations. Sean, anything that we need to touch on there?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think the important thing to remember is, while you're right that the Department of Transportation is a large organization, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is a pretty small entity, the second smallest agency in the department. And that means that they need an awful lot of help policing 560,000 motor carriers in the industry. So, that's sort of why things stream down the way they do. Most of the state law enforcement agencies, they're funded under something called the Motor Carrier Safety Assistance Program, or MCSAP. This essentially pays states to enforce FMCSA's rules to improve CMV safety. So everything's bubbling down, but we've got a very small agency that's charged with enforcing the rules and regulations over a very, very large industry. And so that's why we have this sort of diffuse structure.
Thanks, Sean. So what is a USDOT number in that hierarchy that we have before? How do they identify which vehicles they are developing regulations for and enforcing? And under Regulation 390.21, it requires any vehicle operating under a carrier that is required to have a USDOT number to display not only the number, but the legal name of the carrier. So there's an image there showing the locations where a DOT number could be displayed. And if a carrier is required to have a DOT number, they are operating a vehicle that qualifies for such, which we'll touch on in a couple of slides' time. All vehicles that meet that criteria must display this DOT number and legal name. Now, many of our customers, many carriers out in the industry also display a vehicle number or a asset number, a unit number. They are not related to the federal compliance number in any way. They're purely an internal identifier for fleet managers, for maintenance practices, or for customers. Sean, in terms of 390.21, are there any other sort of requirements or hooks in there that carriers miss?
Yeah, I'm pretty short regulation, but you hit the nail right on the head. USDOT number absolutely required. It's got to be on both sides of the truck. It needs to be sharp contrast, so you need to be able to see it. You can't put blue on blue. It's got to be white on blue or something like that. And this is the fun one. Readily legible from a distance of 50 feet. And, you know, we see a lot of sort of silly violations around illegible or, you know, not readily legible at 50 feet. So I think most people are probably familiar with those, but it's good to review because avoiding silly violations is important to CSA, as we'll learn here in a second.
Sort of like getting your name correct on the top of an exam paper. It's something you probably shouldn't be getting wrong in this day and age.
Or don't forget to put your name on top of the paper. That's the other one that always catches me.
Exactly. So who needs one of these? And this is a big topic. We've been out and met many customers, and state by state, there are so many different variations as to the requirements for this. But I guess at the top banner of the FMCSA and the requirement to have a DOT number really comes down to carriers that are engaged in interstate commerce. And that is a theme that I know, Sean, you and I have talked about a lot. You used the term coming out of the regulations as the furtherance of interstate commerce as well, which has some particular lessons in it for some carriers. But where the federal regulations really draw a line is any carrier that is operating vehicles over 10,000 pounds or 4,536 kilos, or on the passenger side, is designed to used to transport more than 8 passengers, including the driver, for compensation, or a larger sort of van or small coach designed to use to transport more than 15 passengers, including the driver, and is not used to transport passengers for compensation. So that is the basic criteria, provided that these vehicles are also involved in interstate commerce, as we mentioned. So between a place in a state and a place outside of such state, fairly simple, you're crossing the state lines. Between two places in a state but through another state or place outside of the United States. So potentially on the borders where you are sort of tipping in and out, you would be deemed to be involved in interstate commerce. Between two places in a state as part of trade, traffic, or transportation originating or terminating outside of the state or United States. And I guess, Sean, that's the point there where you discussed with me this week about the furtherance of interstate commerce. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty widely, I don't want to say widely misunderstood, but if there's a spot where people sort of make an error, drivers especially when they're certifying for their medical examination or something like that, is the understanding of what exactly is interstate commerce and intrastate commerce. It's not just about the borders it's not just about where you drive. It's about the commodity that you're hauling and where that came from. So the best example that I can think of is if I'm hauling freight from the port, comes off the vessel, or maybe it comes off the train and goes onto my truck, and I deliver it to a warehouse in my state. Well, that move was in furtherance of interstate commerce because that freight came from somewhere else, right? And there's lots of little examples there, and it certainly gets a lot more fuzzy than that. But as a general rule, if I'm staying within my state, I'm probably intrastate unless I'm picking up freight from, you know, a port or something else. And the other thing that I wanted to flag on this slide is this last bit here about designed or used to transport more than 15 passengers and is not used for transport in compensation. I did want to flag that there is currently legislation passed in the House that is seeking, in the House of Representatives here in the U.S., that is seeking to lower that threshold, right? So more folks would be considered, commercial motor vehicle drivers would be required to have CDLs and that sort of thing. So there's an effort afoot to bring that bar a little bit lower to make sure that those transporting passengers are regulated a little bit more heavily.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think you see throughout the legislation, passenger is obviously held in high regard. The value of lives takes a huge precedent over all other types of cargo, obviously. Now, just to sort of complicate things a little bit, is I guess the result of the legacy system being a state-based program that was federalized a number of years ago, which have still left some differences as you travel state by state in terms of their requirements around requiring a DOT number, even for carriers that are potentially transporting cargo or engaged in commerce intrastate. So not crossing state lines, but in North Carolina, for example, I've put some detail there. Their particular threshold is that if you are operating a vehicle over 26,000 pounds, albeit involved in intrastate commerce, or you are transporting more than 16 passengers, including the driver, then you will also be required to get a USDOT number. So another layer of requirements being weaved in by many states, and we'll touch on a list of those states that do have additional requirements in a second. But I guess that whole legacy, Sean, of the state-based system trying to come together in one federal conglomerate, that would have been a difficult task, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, so the U.S. is a collection of states, and that's been our tradition forever. And so there are parts of federal regulations that are controlled by states, and the requirement of a DOT number is one, CDL programs are another. So, you know, with both of those examples, basically what I tell most of our clients is, hey, if you believe that you're in intrastate commerce, truthfully, based on, you know, what we just said, then you better contact your state and make sure you know, because it's impossible to keep track of all of those things. So the same is true with certain elements of the definition of a commercial motor vehicle and some other parts of the federal regulations.
I imagine we would have been here for a few hours if we were trying to outline every state by state difference in the regulations.
Yeah, that's right.
So here's a quick list. We won't dwell on this. These are the states that have particular state-based regulations requiring a USDOT number for intrastate commerce. I know what you're thinking. You're probably looking, are you able to get away with it? Looking for your state. We've simplified this, and these are actually the states. There's a bit of a discrepancy in some of the information, but by and large, these are the states that do not require a DOT number based on intrastate commerce. Some of these may have changed based on the list, but that's the most up-to-date information at hand. So not every state requires state-level numbers, but these are still obviously bound by the federal requirements and those baseline interstate commerce criteria. So how many people are affected by this? There's a lot of carriers, there's a lot of vehicles, there's all sorts of different operations. Anytime you're on the freeway, you're seeing all sorts of DOT numbers on all types of weird and wonderful assets. But As far as the FMCSA is concerned and the number of regulated carriers that they are enforcing, there's 560,000 carriers there or thereabouts. That covers 4.5 million power units, 3.4 million CDL drivers, and total drivers under their guise of 4.9. So it's big numbers when you're looking at the enforcement and policing of all of these regulations. There's a lot of carriers still registered with the FMCSA that have a DOT number that are no longer in operation, that haven't been removed from that list. But these are generally based on all sorts of data inputs like crash stats and things like that, that are operative in the United States at the moment and are adhering to these sort of rules. So it's a big market.
Yeah, I agree, Tim, 100%. I'll say, just the trajectory of this data, about 10 years ago when CSA started, we were looking at about 525,000 motor carriers in the industry. You see here, 2018, 560. I just looked at the numbers this morning, and in December 2019, they show 602,000 motor carriers, which is about a 14% increase. Now, what's concerning about that is the number of truck drivers, CDL holders, remains generally steady. And, what recent data by FTR Associates, Avery Weiss and others, some colleagues, show almost exponential growth, especially recently, of the number of small motor carriers entering the industry. And there's a number of reasons for that, high spikes in spot market values or whatever. But the purpose of me saying that is the number of motor carriers is growing, and it's mostly growing by virtue of smaller carriers leaving their employer to become independent contractors. And that's just sort of the general thrust of the industry.
So it's a lot of people to police, and I guess they have to keep thinking of the most efficient, scalable ways to enforce, police, measure, monitor, all of those things. Such a wide variety of operators and carriers across the country. So the CSA initiative, I guess, sits across the top of that. CSA standing for Compliance, Safety, and Accountability, and it's the key enforcement program of the FMCSA, and it is the mechanism they use to hold carriers and drivers accountable to safety. It affects motor carriers, including owner-operators, by identifying those with safety problems to prioritize them for intervention. So it's essentially looking at the methodology of who is going to be hitting a criteria for investigations, for audits, and prioritizing those over potentially spending time on those carriers and those operators who are generally operating in a far more safe manner.
Yeah, I think, we talked about the smallness of the agency versus the largest in the industry. And, and over 10 years ago, FMCSA was having a hard time policing those folks, right? They could do inspections, but actually getting to the door of motor carriers was very challenging. They didn't have a great way to rate them. So they built this system. They called it Comprehensive Safety Analysis, CSA. It turns out it's neither comprehensive nor a great analysis in some cases. So they changed the name to Compliance, Safety, and Accountability, but it's their way of sort of bubbling up carriers that they think that they should focus on, because they just don't have the manpower to police such a large industry with such a small agency.
Fantastic. Starting to get a couple of questions popping in, and we will get to them at the end of this and make some time for them. So keep any questions coming through. We'd be happy to answer them. And if for whatever reason we don't get to them all in this webinar, we'll come back to you individually, and I can ensure you get the right answer out of myself or Sean. So keep them coming in. We greatly appreciate them. So under the CSA, what is the mechanism? How do they rate and measure carriers, and how do carriers know where they sit in terms of the hierarchy and risk profile of being audited? And the way they do this is through the Safety Measurement System methodology, commonly known as the SMS. And the way that is generally sort of rolled out is through the Behavior Analysis and Safety Improvement category, known as B.A.S.I.C. prioritization status. And that's really, as we have alluded to, why we're here today, is to look at the SMS system, to look at the basics with a particular focus on that maintenance basic. And it's a really interesting system with some complexity in it. Sean is a seasoned pro in how it works. Sean, what's your take on the SMS system? Do you think it's an effective system that the industry understands and agrees with now?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, when CSA was launched in 2010, I was an industry advocate, so I spent a lot of time looking at the system and trying to divine just that question. I think if the question is, does CSA do a generally good job identifying carriers that may be more prone to crashes in the future, my answer would probably be yes, looking at the research. Now, if your question is, does CSA tell me without question the safety posture of a motor carrier, of each motor carrier it rates, I would say no, it probably doesn't do a great job doing that. And then we're going to talk about some of those shortcomings here in the future. It's designed to be an enforcement tool. It's designed to help motor carriers go knock on or law enforcement knock on the door of a motor carrier and say, hey, I think you might have problems. And it serves that purpose, because at that point a motor carrier can say, hey, thanks for coming, let's talk about my problems. But when third parties, you know, and here I'm talking about insurers, banks, shippers, brokers, start using this data to make safety-based decisions, guess what they don't often do? Knock on the door and say, hey, I want to talk about what I see might be your problem. So therein lies some of the rub of CSA. But we're going to talk about some of the shortcomings here in a second.
So the 7 basics, they really do cover everything that you could potentially link to the safety and compliance of carriers. You have unsafe driving, hours of service compliance, which is now commonly referred to as ELD, controlled substances and alcohol, and driver fitness, so licenses and medicals. Very driver focused, obviously, with drivers being at the wheel of some pretty heavy equipment. That is a core component of where the FMCSA and this SMS system is going to track and measure. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have the crash indicator, which I guess is a sort of at-fault debate as to where that could sit, but tracking crashes for carriers. Vehicle maintenance, we will explain shortly why this is such an important basic within this category. And then hazardous materials compliance, which doesn't affect everyone, but if you are carrying hazardous materials, understandable as to why there would be some particular rules and regulations and additional coverage around how you're transporting and managing something along those lines. Anything within these, Sean, that you think people get confused with or think potentially doesn't fall within the FMCSA rules? Or from your experience with your clients, everyone has a fairly good handle on what each of these basics means to them?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to remember about basics is they're not all created equal, right? Some are better than others. If we're measuring unsafe driving, that has a stronger correlation to future crash risk because of what you're measuring. You know, lane deviation and speeding and following too closely. Those are things that lead to accidents, right? Crash indicators, any insurer will tell you that, unfortunately, if you get in a crash, you're more likely to get in a crash in the future. But there's also a bunch of basics in there that are compliance related and don't often have that much to do with safety, like driver fitness, where we're talking about, oh, my driver is medically qualified to drive, but he forgot his certificate on that day if he's driving a vehicle under, you know, that's not required to have, or that doesn't require a CDL, or, you know, controlled substance and alcohol. Really, nobody has any information in there. So these aren't all created equal. Some have a stronger correlation to crash risk. There's been a lot of study and research on these, and some have hardly any, like the hazardous materials compliance basic.
And I guess the other key point with those basics there is they're sort of an easily digestible way that overlay on all of the rules and regulations in CFR 49. That is quite a hard read if you were to go through and try and interpret it all. The SMS system sort of surfaces up a very understandable way to focus on different components of compliance. But each of these, as we'll touch on with vehicle maintenance, I guess has a bit of a crossover between several pieces of legislation and different chapters within it.
Yeah, I think the big benefit to a carrier from CSA is being able to focus, like you said, on particular violations or particular problems that they might have, rather than just getting a dump of data. Things are at least in categories, and you can learn how the system works and learn how to, I don't want to say game the system, but learn how to keep your scores low where you can keep your scores low.
I'm not even going to start this slide, Sean. This is your masterpiece.
Yeah.
Equation at the top. I said this is something that you can absolutely own. So tell us about it.
Yeah, I thought I'd just kind of go over to sort of set the table for us as we talk about the vehicle maintenance basic, and I'm assuming actually a large portion of the audience understands this very well, but hopefully I can provide just a little bit of insight. Essentially, each basic is a calculation of a bunch of data, right? Roadside inspection, violation data, some carrier demographic data, depending on what basic you're talking about, crash data, that sort of thing. And the vehicle maintenance basic is no different. In fact, the vehicle maintenance basic is calculated in exactly the same way as a bunch of other basics, with the exception of unsafe driving and the crash indicator. But what we're doing here on this basic is we're taking all of your violations. So every time you get a violation on roadside, it's graded by severity. And you can see here on the bottom of this slide, on the bottom right, we show some severity weights of some pretty common vehicle maintenance violations. So in the case of the first one, tire tread less than 2/32, that violation weight is 8, right? And that violation weight is multiplied by your time weight. So if that violation happened within the last 6 months, that'd be 8 times 3. You're looking at 24 points, right? If it's 6 to 12 months, that's 8 times 2. Or it's just 1 if it happened 24 or 12 to 24 months. So as violations get older, they become less important to the mathematical equation, right? And so you take time weight multiplied by severity weight. That gives you your top, and then on the bottom is just the full time weight of all your relevant inspections. So each inspection that you get is given a time weight, and that whether or not you get a violation in that inspection, you have a time weight. So if I have a totally clean inspection, I get a time weight of 3. Okay, and that's important to remember, because that's your denominator, and it divides your time multiplied by severity weight, and it comes up with this basic measure, and that's just an absolute score. It's usually in vehicle maintenance, it's like a 1 point something or a 2 point something, and you're grouped into a bunch of carriers with similar amounts of inspections, right? And your measure is added to that group, and then that group is organized from smallest measure to its highest measure. And the highest measure is given the highest percentile rate. So, if you have the worst measure, you'll have a percentile ranking of 100, and that will be very bad. So then they take that percentile weight, and they have here what's their intervention threshold. So if you're above the 80th percentile, that's bad, and that means FMCSA is going to start looking at you a little harder. So I did want to just sort of set the table a little bit to talk about how they create those, and then to talk a little bit too about some of those shortcomings that we talked about. And I see the shortcomings based on this slide, specifically in this relevant inspection metric, and that's because, as you can see, each safety event group has its own grouping of carriers, right? And they're all scored relative to one another. So your measure, your absolute measure, if you're in, say, safety event group 1, might be, for example, to make it easy, say your measure is a 2, and that's a pretty good score. That's a 50%, right? But now, if you go to the next group, and now you're in safety event group 2, which is 11 to 20 relevant events, and your measure is 2, well, once you're re-ranked with all those other motor carriers, that 2 might actually put you in alert status, right? So the system isn't created equally. And as you start running between safety event groups, that creates additional challenge. There's also regional enforcement disparity problems, which is the fact that if you drive in Texas, you're more likely to get a vehicle maintenance violation than if you drive in Indiana. And that's just based on enforcement priorities of the law enforcement or of the state in which you're operating. And then the last thing is, not all of these, the way they created the severity weights of these violations was based on expert opinion, right? It's validated through statistical operations, but it's initially based on expert opinions. And there's a lot of folks that would say, tire depth or some of these other things, whether or not my driver is using a seatbelt doesn't actually impact the safety of the commercial motor vehicle, but it's given a high weight. So that can create some inaccuracies in the system as well. And then finally, the last point I wanted to make, and we're going to hammer this home a little bit later, 3 ways to improve your CSA score, right? Number 1, get clean inspections. We talked about how clean inspections have a severity weight, or have a time weight, but no severity weight. That's going to improve your score. Number 2, these violations age off. Every 2 years, any violation you had more than 2 years ago, that leaves and your score improves. And number 3, data queues. If you get a violation that you shouldn't have gotten, FMCSA has a system that allows you to challenge that and get it removed from your score. Those are the only 3 ways to improve your CSA score, outside of not getting violations in the first place, which I know, Tim, you're going to talk about in a little bit. So hopefully that was helpful, if not more confusing.
I think it was really helpful, but it certainly points to the fact as to why you guys are so busy. There's certainly some questions I imagine a lot of carriers have around that. You mentioned getting those points and those percentile rankings and thresholds. So how are these policed on the road? We've talked about the highway patrol, the enforcement agencies. What is their sort of inspection process? And I guess a high level, looking at some numbers for the financial year 2020, 95% of these inspections on vehicles or drivers are conducted by state inspectors. So very few roadside inspections conducted by the feds. These are all state level, either highway patrol or DOT inspectors. These inspections make a decision on whether the vehicle is compliant with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, the FMCSAs, and whether, most importantly for a lot of carriers, whether those violations justify the vehicle being placed out of service. Violations are obviously one thing. Having that vehicle placed out of service, out of business, off the road for a period of time, that has a big impact on the carrier. So out of service violations and what some of the leading trends of those are, we'll touch on in a second. They are a really important piece of this puzzle. Last year, over 2.3 million vehicle inspections conducted annually, 3.7 million violations. So what that breaks down to is an average of 1.6 violations per inspection. And that's also another important point, is if you're going to get a full walk-around inspection from an inspector on the side of the road, you may walk away with a number of different violations on different components of your vehicle under vehicle maintenance, and they could all contribute to that decreasing or diminishing safety score and increase your chances of an intervention. There's 6 levels of inspection types focusing on different levels of detail. They're the full inspection, the walk around, driver only, a special study, terminal, and radioactive materials. Sean, is there a big difference in all of those, and how do inspectors decide what sort of inspection they're going to undertake on a particular vehicle?
Yeah, I mean, first I'll start by saying this is absolutely where the rubber meets the road, especially in the vehicle maintenance category. Almost all your violations are going to come from roadside inspections. Very few people are getting compliance reviews anyway, so it's super important to have good inspections and good inspection protocols. The levels of inspection are absolutely different. The most common, or the full inspection, is a level 1. They're going to look at your driver. They're going to get under your truck. Walk around is going to look for sort of obvious things. Those can be elevated to a level 1 if possible. Your driver inspection is just driver credentials, and that really depends. All of this depends on sort of what the goals of the state enforcement agency are in that during that time. And there's a bunch of sort of focused inspection activities, road check and brake check and driver check, and all of these things that happen that might bump up the number, may cause a certain type of inspection over another. I also wanted to highlight, 2.3 million vehicle inspections annually for fiscal year 2020. That does seem like a high number, but don't forget that this was a COVID year, and almost every year there are around 3.5 million inspections annually, and they're right in about 5.7 million violations. So those numbers look big, but they're not as big as they could be. So.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, it's certainly a lot. With the audits and mentioning a COVID year, I learned a lot from the webinar that your colleague Dave presented for the Trucking Association of Massachusetts a week or so ago on offsite audits, and potentially something we could weave into a slide further down. Investigations. Speak of the devil, audits. This is what a lot of carriers are seeking to avoid. This is really where you are put to the test in terms of your adherence to compliance, to the FMCSAs. And as we've alluded to, it is really your basic scores that are going to encourage the investigators to come and knock on your door. 2018 numbers, there were nearly 15,000 investigations across the US. And investigations are generally handled by federal investigators, certainly the majority of the time, something that they take more charge of rather than the state level DOTs. There are 6 types of investigations or audit types that Sean may touch on after this, and they range from broad, comprehensive, sort of all-in-one overviews right through to more highlighted areas of concern. If you were getting repeated violations or there was red flags coming through some of your basic scores in a particular area of your operation that was cause for concern, they may come in and just focus on particular vehicles, particular drivers, or particular parts of your process that they had some questions to ask about. And to my point, an increasing number of audits are now off-site and facilitated remotely. And Sean, I guess that has a pro and a con to carriers in the sense that they're not coming on site, but it really does put a focus on your documentation, on your process, and being able to provide information back to the investigators, albeit remotely. Yeah,
that's 100% right. One of the most challenging parts of an audit is trying to produce your paperwork within 48 hours of request. And a lot of carriers go through sort of annual exercises where they choose a few vehicles, and we help carriers through this process sometimes and ask them to produce the documentation. I'll reinforce a few things here too, to say that the trend to offsite audits is real, that under COVID protocols, offsite audits couldn't be used for vehicle maintenance, but they can today. The audit procedure remains the same, with the difference that they don't actually inspect any of your trucks. So the auditing on the vehicle maintenance basic is still happening. In fact, there are 3 basics that trigger most audits. That's in order of importance: hours of service, vehicle maintenance, and unsafe driving. So those are very real. Carriers are generally grouped into high, medium, and low risk based on their CSA score. So CSA informs all of this. If you're a high risk carrier, expect to knock on the door. For high risk carriers, they're going to look at those 3 basics. Those are going to be very important.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So back to something that's certainly close to our hearts at Whip Around, and I'll touch on why later on in this presentation. But the vehicle maintenance basic, it really is an obvious one within the compliance framework. It is the condition, safety, and I guess operability of the equipment on your vehicle and the vehicle itself. And that really overlays some key pieces of legislation within 49 CFR, and those are parts 392, 393, and 396, which firstly is the inspection of cargo securement devices and equipment, and that's part 392. Part 393 is the parts and accessories necessary for safe operation, And part 396 is inspection, repair, and maintenance. And this is where the DVIR component falls under, which is 396.11. So we might skip on to the next slide to touch on a little bit more about why the vehicle maintenance basic is so important. The vehicle maintenance basic has a very high significance when investigators are looking for reasons to come and knock on your door. It has a direct impact on safety, on the safety of other road users, and demonstrated within that is the higher proportion of out of service violations that come from vehicle maintenance related violations. So over 20%, and this is very consistent, this is year on year, over 20% of roadside inspections end in an out of service violation or order, and this is related to vehicle maintenance. For comparison, only 5% are for driver related inspections, so whether that's hours of service or substance abuse, etc., and 4% for hazmat. Again, an interesting basic. But Sean, vehicle maintenance, it seems so obvious. 20% of roadside inspections end in out of service orders. That seems like a high number.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and I think that's why FMCSA consistently targets vehicle maintenance. You know, these numbers never change. As long as I've been looking at them, you know, we've always been right around 20. That's all our ballpark, right around 5% for driver. I mean, that's just the way it always is. And so if your numbers are higher than that, you know, that we need to think about what your maintenance program is and why it is that way, because that's going to be a pretty easy red flag for just about anybody. It's one of the first things they look at. Also, out of service violations, you get 2 extra points on your severity weight in your vehicle maintenance basic. So you want to avoid these at all costs, and a lot of these are easy ones to avoid. And second off, jumping an out of service order, so operating a vehicle that's been declared out of order before it's been repaired, is the only acute violation. So there are critical and acute violations that FMCSA focuses on during any audit. That's the only acute violation really in the vehicle maintenance category. So if your out of service is north of 20%, we got to find ways to fix your vehicle maintenance program before it comes to bite you.
And I think what you said there about having a program in place is such a key component of this. We will see on the next slide some of the leading reasons that violations are being given out, and clearly things happen when you're on the road. You incur damage, tires get impacted, bulbs might blow, but so much of it does seem preventable. And, you know, with the customers we work with, putting that program in place can eliminate so many of these unnecessary violations or potentially out of service orders along the way.
Absolutely.
So what sort of things are causing these violations? And this list here is in order of the most common items to cause a violation. And they are as simple as they seem. And I guess this is just such an important point here, that you do not want to be getting violations. They do accumulate. You don't want that SMS score to start getting anywhere near that threshold where you might trigger an investigation. And to have points docked against your name for things like lights, brakes, lack of periodic inspection, fire extinguishers, leaks, inoperative turn signals, lighting devices or reflective material missing, and tires. These are things that by and large could be prevented through a proper inspection process before these vehicles hit the road. It's surprising that so many of these things are at the top of this list, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, these are pre-trip inspection violations. You should check your permit book, make sure you have, you know, notice periodic inspection, fire extinguishers. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, like a good, some of this happens en route. I don't want to point fingers that should be pointed, but so many more of them, it's highly unlikely that your tire tread goes below 2:30 seconds if you checked it on pre-trip inspection or in your DVIR process and post-trip. So, you know, but it's it's low-hanging fruit for FMCSA, and that's another reason why they really hang on on the vehicle maintenance basic, because they can pull you over, and if they look hard enough, they can find a violation.
Yeah, and some of those, and I guess it is logical, but looking at some of the numbers, I've got the ANI portal here, the analysis and information online, which is a really useful data set here from the FMCSA. 45% of inoperative turn signal violations result in out of service orders. So it's not just the violations you're getting here. If you've got, you know, a bulb out in an inoperative turn signal, you're nearly always going to be put out of service. Anything brake related, 100% of brake related issues where over 20% of brakes on a particular vehicle are either not working properly or inoperative, 100% out of service. So it's not just the violations you're going to get. There is a more serious aspect to these where the enforcement agent defines these to be quite critical. You know, very high numbers of these being pushing vehicles to being out of service.
Agreed.
So I'm a motor carrier. I've just heard all of that. I want to get in and understand where I sit in this. The safety measurement system has quite a well displayed portal where carriers can go in and assess their SMS scores, dive into a whole lot of detail around their performance, their violations, and I guess understand and identify areas where they can develop a program to either correct some action or as you touched on a little bit earlier, potentially go into data queues and look at defending some of the violations that came with them. How often would you recommend carriers be looking at the SMS portal here, Sean?
You know, at least monthly. The information, the publicly available information is based on a snapshot of the MICMIS data, the underlying database, and that happens every month. So if you're not looking at your CSA score to see how it changed every month, you're not doing it regularly enough. So at the very least.
Great.
And if you have other programs or providers that can provide that information more quickly, I'd use those as well.
Fantastic. And we'll quickly touch on this, conscious of time. So this is where we talk about the intervention threshold, and you'll see this within the SMS portal here. You'll see where you currently sit. This example has the 45th percentile, and the vehicle maintenance basic has a 80% intervention threshold. There are obviously different thresholds for different types of carriers. So you've got passenger carrier, hazardous materials, and general. And each of them have a slightly different but logical threshold for an intervention. Clearly, if you are a passenger carrier and you are involved in a lot of crashes, you're probably going to have a slight red mark against your name and have someone knocking at your door fairly frequently. At the other end of the scale, a general motor carrier under the vehicle maintenance basic, that has a slightly higher threshold at 80%. But I guess there's more items within that. You're going to be more susceptible to a lot of violations within there. They do add up more quickly than, I guess, you know, crashes or potentially even hours of service. Sean, I might let you lead into this one and just some of the useful ways that the SMS portal can surface information for carriers looking to dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think this portal over time, certainly since, you know, it was launched in 2010, has improved in a lot of ways. And one of the most important, the most valuable things to carriers from CSA and SMS is their ability to sort of drill down a little bit and discover where some of their problems are. And so we've highlighted just these three sort of categories that they provide you in the SMS. The first is violation summary, and this is a really great way to just, especially if you're a medium-sized carrier who might be getting a decent amount of inspections, to just be able to pull this up and say, okay, here's my biggest violation problem. You know, I need to increase my tire rotation schedule because I'm having lots of problems with tires or that sort of thing. You can use inspection history, and all this data is downloadable. You can download this data into Excel. You can use inspection history to discover which your drivers are doing a great job, doing a pre-inspection, pre-trip or post-trip inspection. How's that going? You know, and then Finally, investigation results. We talked about acute and critical violations. If you have any of those, you need to address them right away. If you have an acute violation, FMCSA is required to investigate that if they come knocking on your door. And, you know, with critical violations, the thing you want to make sure there is that there's no pattern of those violations. If critical violations happen over and over again, that's when you start to get in trouble.
Absolutely. So a few pointers, I guess. What are some simple things to focus on to stay ahead of the curve here, to minimize your chances of getting violations, out of service orders, or ultimately having a federal agency knock on your door to conduct an investigation or do that virtually through an offsite? The 4 key pillars really that feed into the vehicle maintenance basic are, firstly, under that 392 cargo securement. Secondly, proactive maintenance. That's being able to demonstrate that you do have a plan to schedule and enact repairs and maintenance on your vehicles. Thirdly, reactive maintenance. That really falls squarely in DVIR, something very, very true to what we do at Whip Around. And then the fourth is record keeping. There's no point doing all of that stuff generally if you're not able to prove that you've done it and surface that information for an investigation should it come your way. So 4 key pillars that we'll touch on shortly in these next few slides. And hopefully that will give you a really clear, simple way to understand how you can put yourself in the best possible position to stay as compliant and ahead of any of those potential pitfalls under the SMS. Cargo securement. This really, I guess when I first learned about cargo securement being part of the vehicle maintenance basic, I was a little bit surprised, but it makes a lot of sense. And Sean, you might touch on after this how the vehicle maintenance basic actually used to be called the cargo securement basic or something to that effect. But what it really covers is that cargo is a critical part of that carrier, and all of the equipment required to keep that safe and on the vehicle in a balanced and well-distributed manner are critical to the safety of that vehicle. So that includes tailgates, tailboards, tarpaulins, curtains, all of those sorts of things. And there is an onus on the driver not only to be confident that that cargo is well distributed and safe before they depart on a particular journey, but they also have to stop and regularly check the cargo as part of that journey. And there's some qualifications and points within that journey they need to do that within the first 50 miles of their trip is the first one. And then whichever happens first out of a driver making a change to his or her duty status around hours of service, the commercial motor vehicle has been driven for 3 hours, or the commercial motor vehicle has been driven for 150 miles, whichever occurs first out of those 3. So some very regular and defined points where the cargo must be inspected, Sean.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, to your point, there was a cargo-related basic when CSA just started that contained a whole bunch of hazardous material type violations, which have a whole different sort of compliance schedule. So they did break those out to vehicle maintenance, but you know, cargo securement is what it sounds like. Is the cargo, have you failed to secure it properly? Is it falling or leaking? If it's a liquid cargo, is it spilling? Have you immobilized? Do you have sufficient tie downs if you're a flatbed? So these two, in most cases, very preventable. I mean, there are some cases where you pick up a sealed trailer and you don't know what's inside, and that can be a challenge. But you know, for the most part, this should be low-lying fruit for you.
Proactive maintenance. Now, this should be something that every fleet manager or organization that manages a fleet of commercial vehicles has some plan in place. I guess where some of the pitfalls of this are, Sean, and you've probably seen what I've seen over the years visiting, you know, hundreds of customers. A lot of this is being done on whiteboards and on spreadsheets or on pieces of paper, back of envelopes sitting on office desks. And I guess that's a pretty ineffective way to manage a proactive maintenance program. And what's required here really is not only to affect the repairs and the maintenance when it's due, but also to be able to demonstrate that you have a plan in place. You are actually planning to maintain and service those vehicles, what that is, when it's due to be completed, and then have a proof of the work that's been done, who it's been done by, when it was done, and have all of that available so that you can provide that to an agency if they came knocking to say, look, we've done all of this and this is what we plan to do in the future. That's really the two sides that give confidence that you are managing your compliance.
Yep, 100%. If I'm auditing a motor carrier, I'm selecting vehicles based on crashes or high violation rates. I'm asking for the vehicle files, and the first thing I'm looking for is, do you have a schedule? You put your schedule of maintenance in there, and some people don't necessarily keep it in the vehicle maintenance file, but there should be an extra one in there. So I want to know, do you have a systematic way to know what needs to be repaired and to repair it and to prove that it's been repaired in the future? And that's important from a compliance standpoint, but that's going to be important from a liability standpoint. If there's a wreck, that's going to be important from a whole bunch of other sort of angles. So absolutely. Do I have a systemic way to maintain my vehicle, and can I keep track of it? Am I performing my annual periodic inspections, that sort of thing? A lot of people just rely on vendors to do that and look at, hey, that's okay. The rules say that you need to inspect and maintain or cause to have it maintained. So you can use a vendor for that, and they can even keep your files if you want, as long as you trust them enough and you can get those files within 48 hours.
Totally. It's an important piece of the puzzle. Reactive maintenance. Now, again, a fairly logical thing that you would imagine most carriers are undertaking, but the way that we see a lot of people carrying out their reactive maintenance at the moment, by far the most common method to carry this out that we see is paper inspection sheets. And yes, that does comply with your DVIR, but there are so many pitfalls of pieces of paper holding such important and critical information to potentially the compliance of your fleet. The undertakings or requirements of 39611, which is driver vehicle inspection reports, require that a motor carrier must have their drivers complete a report in writing at the end of each day. So whether they're coming back to home base or whether they're going coast to coast, the end of each workday, they must complete a written inspection at the end of that shift, and it must cover a set of important items, very, very linked to safety. Things like service brakes, parking brakes, steering mechanisms, lighting devices, reflectors, tires, horn, windshield wipers, rear vision mirrors, coupling devices, wheels, emergency equipment, etc. Now, the report must identify the vehicle and any defects that would affect safety or result in a mechanical breakdown. Drivers are not required to prepare that report or submit it if no deficiency is discovered. So commonly known as the no defect DVIR, but the actual undertaking of completing that inspection on a vehicle every day and identifying any issues that may impact the safety of that vehicle is just at the absolute crux of not only setting up that maintenance program as well and understanding that vehicle, but very much mitigating some of the fines and violations that you may get on the side of the road if you're not identifying these and repairing them before an enforcement officer does.
Yeah, and the only thing I would say to that, Tim, is I can remember when the FMCSA revoked the requirement to keep your no defect DVIRs, and I remember they claimed they saved the industry $1 billion doing that. And I got a good chuckle at that, because a lot of the carriers that I know, they find the full DVIR process valuable to them in a way beyond compliance, right? I mean, they want a record of that DVIR, whether or not it was clean or not. Otherwise, they can't track back the safety of that vehicle, in key cases, just for their own safety and for their own liability. So you're right, you don't need to keep a DVIR if there's no defect on it, but I can tell you that there's a lot of players in the industry that are keeping every one of those, and you can't blame them.
Yeah, and that's what we see with our customers as well. Look, we're hitting 9 o'clock. We're going to keep going for a couple more minutes. So the recording of this, if you did have to jump off now, will be distributed, so you can always pick up the end, but we'd love you to stay on, and we've only got a couple more slides to go and some really interesting topics that we'll quickly cover. So if you've got the time, please do stay on, and we'll get the rest of this information across to you. Record keeping, we've touched on record keeping. I think it's a very obvious one. It falls into all of those categories that we've just talked to, your reactive maintenance with DVIR, your proactive maintenance with scheduling services and repairs. All of that needs to be kept somewhere so that you have the proof to whoever may come asking that you have actually done what you've said you've done. So it's a very logical thing. Whip around, for example, we make this very easy for our customers by storing it all in the cloud. You can draw down on it, you can search it, you can file it, you can export it to somebody else at the drop of a hat. This gentleman here is one of our customers, and this was not his only filing cabinet full of compliance records, I can assure you. So it is something that is very important, but time consuming and often difficult to do. Record keeping requirements, there is some rules and regs around that, Sean. You've got annual inspections needing to be kept for 14 months. You've got your DVIR needing to be kept for 90 days. And then you've got your DVIR for 1 year. Do you want to elaborate on that?
No, it's a total train wreck. Everything's difficult, you know, and so, I mean, I have a pretty good handout that'll give you sort of the general requirements. So, and I can provide it to you, Tim, and you can send it out to your folks. You got to pay attention to it, though. The only other thing I'd say about record keeping is if you don't have a business purpose to keep that record past the record retention requirement, consider purging it. I've done audits where I found old violations on files that, you know, they no longer needed to retain that information, but it was in that file, and so I was able to find that violation. So I'd stick to the record keeping requirements. There are business cases where you need information for longer, especially if the vehicle was in a wreck or something like that. But, you know, you're required to retain it, and you should keep it just for as long as they expect. So
absolutely makes sense. So some tips for success on how we're going to give our audience here today some advice on improving not only their score as it stands. You've touched on some points with that, but some processes internally and some things to pay attention to, and potentially some changes to how they work to succeed when it comes to compliance and remove the stress and hassle and liability of what all of that means, so they can focus on what matters most, and that is keeping customers happy, growing their business, profitability, and keeping vehicles on the road.
Yeah, I think the purpose of this webinar was to try to, you know, provide some takeaway for some folks. So, you know, here's our general tips for success. You want to pay attention to how you operate as well as where you operate. And I've seen a lot of very interesting analysis about certain localities, certain inspection stations, certain counties in certain states that love to write certain violations, right? And so if you're going into one of those spots and you know seatbelts are a thing today, make sure you got all your guys belted up, you know, or if you know they're really looking at lights, look at it, or even if it makes sense, avoid the location, unless you're good and you want the clean inspection. So how you operate is important, but so too is where you operate. Can't stress this enough. Solid pre and post trip inspection makes a big difference. I know, especially pre-ELDs, there were a lot of drivers that just put 15 minutes on their logs as on duty not driving because they knew it was required, but weren't conducting the inspections. If you conduct the inspections, you could save yourself a lot of time being out of service, like we talked about, or, you know, making a maintenance problem worse. So super important to make sure that you're doing that. Know what your most common violations are, 100%. You can find these on FMCSA's A&I, like you talked about. Inoperable required lamps, operating without your proof of periodic inspection, brakes out of adjustment, fire extinguishers, turn signals. Enforcement folks are just like us, right? Their brain is only so big. They're gonna you know, remember 4 or 5. They're gonna look for those every time. So know where you're going, know where the trends are, and know where your own organizational weaknesses are. And that's where your inspection process really comes from. Hey, I'm getting a lot of tire violations. Time to check those. Time to have a focus, right? Your safety process needs to be iterative. It needs to continue to evolve based on where your newest challenges are, right? A lot of carriers now are rewarding drivers for clean roadside inspections. We talked about the value of a clean roadside inspection. So you can reward your driver for a clean roadside inspection. You can reward your maintenance facility for taking care of DVIR defects quickly. You know, those can really be helpful to create that safety culture. Preventative maintenance matters 100%. Fix your vehicle components before the scheduled time, right? We didn't have a long conversation about this, but remember that your inspection selection system score matters as well. That's whether that helps inform roadside inspection whether or not they're going to pull you in. And don't forget, you can always use data cues to try to improve your chances for clean inspection. So I have there. I see Tim left us, but I think this next slide is mine anyway.
I planned to the hour, so I'm just replugging in. But you kick on there, Sean. This is something very close to your expertise.
Yeah. So we're going to prognosticate a little bit. We're going to talk about what's next in CSA, right? And in the U.S. and CSA, we've been talking a lot about this relatively new idea, item response theory. And the government was required to study this. A bunch of academics, Harvard grads, PhDs came up with this complicated statistical system called item response theory, and the government is supposed to decide whether or not they want to use this. It is very complicated, and if it comes to fruition, it's likely to change most things you understand about CSA. It's going to measure the same things generally, but it's going to look totally different. Your inspection process, your vehicle maintenance is still going to be important, but how important is going to change. And so we want to keep our eye on this. We expect some kind of decision coming in early 2021. We know the Trump administration really wanted to make a decision on this before the election, but there was some turnover at the agency. They didn't get that done. So now there's a real question. We thought the Trump administration would just turn it down, would say, you know what, we're not interested in this. The industry is not making a big squawk about it. Maybe we shouldn't go down the IRT path. I don't know if an administrative change will change that idea, given that IRT is just statistically well-founded and has some potential benefits. It's just a lot harder to understand. So we just want to keep our eye on whether or not IRT is coming. My money's on no, but all bets are off with an administrative change. There's a thing called the Crash Preventability Program. We do a whole nother training on this. Basically, it's an opportunity for you to improve your CSA scores by contesting the preventability of particular class of crashes. So be aware of that program and use it wherever possible. That program uses this data cues system. You use data cues to contest crashes. I think that means that a lot more carriers are going to begin using data cues. And if you're not using data cues today, that means that carriers that you're scored relative against are going to see their scores go down or improve, and you're going to see yours go up. So turn to data cues, start using it to improve your score. And that's what I got. The rest is all you, Tim.
Great. Last two slides, and I'll skim through them. You know, the real focus of this webinar has been the vehicle maintenance basic, but we've got a great mix of people in the audience here. We've got a bunch of whip around customers, and I thank you greatly for your custom and for your support and advocacy, and hopefully you've taken something away from today. For those that aren't whip around customers, our solution is built from the ground up to solve this problem for the vehicle maintenance basic for fleet managers. That's what we do. We don't do ELD, we don't do vehicle tracking, we don't do telematics. We want to specialize in this space, and that is the product that we've built. We have a focus on DVIR, we understand the compliance. We do things that many other DVIR add-ons for platforms like ELDs don't do. We have the 3 required signatures from drivers and mechanics, and again from the driver when a defect has been corrected. We automate those workflows, so no matter where your vehicles are, obviously if a defect is flagged from a DVIR, anyone in your organization can be aware of it and take action and prevent either further violations or issues coming from that vehicle being on the road without it being repaired. We obviously automate all of the record keeping because it's all stored in the cloud. But the feedback we get from our customers is just richer information. We enable all sorts of different ways and workflows for forms to be customized on our platform, not just DVIR, equipment, all sorts of other different assets, multi-choice, multi-check, photo cards, anything to deliver our customers more and better, clearer information on what is going on in their vehicles out in the field. So it is what we do. It's what we specialize in. We'd love to show you what we do if you're not a Whip Around customer already. And the second component of what we do is called Whip Around Maintain. And we added this about a year ago. It was a logical flow on from the inspect piece that we had built for DVIR. And this really solves the remainder of that vehicle maintenance basic compliance, which is preventative maintenance. It enables you to create and set maintenance and service schedules. You receive alerts and reminders when they're due based on mileage. We do track and capture mileage using our app, using optical character recognition. So you just take a picture of the odometer, we read the mileage, and then we trigger off alerts and notifications for any maintenance. So there's no need for hardware or tracking if you're not into that. You obviously have a maintenance history because all of that that is in Whip Around can be exported. You're going to be able to quickly and easily show somebody what you've done, who did it. You can track parts and labor cost in that, and all of that at the click of a button. Any issues that come from either your service planning or your reactive maintenance from DVIR can be paired together into a quick and easy work order for mechanics, which you can send very quickly digitally. So we sort of focus on the complete vehicle maintenance basic in a sense, and we tick all of those boxes. As I said, it's what we specialize in. If you're interested in seeing what we do, contact us today. Our website here, whiparound.com. Mention to the team that you've been on this webinar, and we'll look after you. For the Whip Around customers that are on today, if you haven't had a demo of our Whip Around Maintain solution and would like to do that, get in touch as well and mention that you were on this webinar, and we'll look after you in that sense as well. So we'd love to have a chat. Thank you all for taking the time. I know we ran over time a little bit, but I'm glad that we got it all covered, and this video and recording will be available and sent out to all attendees via email so that you can review it. Contact me for anything, tim@whiparound.com. If you come through me, I'll put you in touch with the right person, or if you've got any questions. I've got the questions from this webinar here, and I will come back to everyone individually via email on those, if that's all right, after I have a chat to Sean, but nothing I don't think we can't answer there for you. And Sean's contact details there as well. Sean, thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this webinar today. You're a real champion for Whip Around, and such an expert in this field that we greatly appreciate. So thanks so much.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Tim. Thanks, everybody. Feel free to reach out with any additional questions or concerns.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.